to a small college in Ohio, Baldwin Wallace College, studied political science. And there was a group of students that went to this university with me, and they were from Brazil. And at the time, Lula da Silva from the Workers' Party, a socialist, was the president. So one day I asked them what they thought of Lula da Silva. And they said, he's awful. They said, he's just awful. He's awful. And I said, well, you know, I said, what's wrong with him? They said, well, the only reason Lula da Silva is elected is because we have this law in Brazil that says that everyone has to vote. That everyone has to vote. Can you believe this? Everyone has to vote. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, it's this problem that, you know, that if you know, you don't vote, someone can vote in your place, and there could be fraud. So everyone's required. They can leave their ballot blank, but they have to vote. So everyone's required to vote, and so they vote for Lula da Silva. And I said, okay. So I said, so, you know, what's the issue here? And they said, well, all these illiterate people, all these poor people, all these low-income people who have no education and no understanding of politics, they're all voting. And I said, okay, and they're voting for Lula da Silva. They're voting for him. And I said, why are they voting for him? They said, because he just gives them all jobs. And I said that he gives them jobs. They said, yeah, it's just he gives them jobs. I mean, they all have jobs now. He gave them the jobs, so they vote for him. It's a disaster. I said, wow, you know. And then I asked them, you know, the other problems with Lula da Silva, and they said, you know, it's so humiliating for us. Did you know that at one time, before Lula da Silva was president, many years ago, he delivered packages in the mail. He was a mailman. Can you believe this? And I said, what? They said, Brazil, we're a dignified country. We're being represented by a mailman, a postal worker. Oh, this is such humiliation for us. You know, we're not like the rest of South America. We're dignified. We speak Portuguese, not Spanish. This is so humiliating for us. That conversation that I had with those Brazilian students at my college was probably more educational for me about the nature of politics in Latin America than anything I could have ever read in a book. The fact that they would oppose him on those grounds, that he gives all the poor people jobs, that these people who have no business in politics are voting, you know? And in a way, I hate to say it, but I heard some echoes of that in the aftermath of the election here in the United States when Donald Trump won. You'll have to remember that, right? There was a lot of people saying that all these people in the Midwest and Ohio and all of that, you know, I'm not a Trump supporter, but you have to remember that rings some bells for what the Democrats were saying in the aftermath of the recent election. But, you know, I've been to Venezuela. I haven't been, Dakota was there more recently than I was, but I was there in 2015. And I was there in the aftermath of the first election that the United Socialist Party and Maduro and the Chavez forces lost. I was there. 2015, in December of 2015, they had a vote. And I was there, and I remember that, I went through different neighborhoods. And I walked through a certain neighborhood in central Caracas. And, you know, they had, you know, the local member of the city council that walked with us. And I asked him, you know, what has the government done for this neighborhood? And he said, okay. He said, do you see all these houses all around me? And I said, yes. He said, these houses were all built with interest-free loans that we provided for the people here. I said, wow. And he said, all these houses are heated, and they get heating gas that we provide for free to the neighborhoods here. And I said, wow. I was just blown away. And then he pointed toward a beautiful, just this beautiful auditorium that was built. And it's where they have like the local high school graduations and ceremonies. And he said, you know, we built this. You know, we built this for the community here. Anyone in the community can reserve it. It's, you know, just a public auditorium that's available. And I said, what was it, you know, before Chavez came to power, before you started moving down the road towards socialism? And they said, well, before that, this was the area where people who stole cars would take them and break them up violently. And this was the place to buy heroin. This was the heroin buying place. And now it's this beautiful auditorium. That's what the Bolivarian Revolution has done. And they told me about the 1990s. And, you know, to set the stage for what happened in Venezuela, you have to understand what was happening in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this feeling that the fall of the Soviet Union proved that capitalism was the permanent system. There could be no opposition to capitalism. And so people like Milton Friedman, people like Jeffrey Sachs started to have, you know, kind of domination of the discourse. And all over Latin America, you saw just the privatization and just the gutting of the economies there. Everything was being privatized. And these countries were dependent on the International Monetary Fund to get what was called development loans. So Venezuela had a government, and this government would get development loans from the IMF and from the World Bank. And they would get these loans, and to get these loans, they had to follow the dictates of the international bankers. So they would get a loan, and then they would come back to get their next loan, and they'd say, okay, well, your public budget is too big, so you got to lay off this many government workers, you got to cut spending on this. And so they talked about how during the 1990s in Venezuela, there were times when the entire neighborhoods would be without electricity because they didn't have the budget to keep the power on. And they talked about how in the 1990s in Venezuela, there were times where in order to get the garbage collected, because so many sanitation workers were laid off, the community would have to burn tires and block the major intersections. There was a community organizer who said in order to get the garbage collected in this neighborhood, that he had gone around and that his volunteers from his political organization collected all the garbage, and they'd taken it to a major highway and dumped it on a major highway and blocked the highway. And so finally, the government was forced to send the garbage to be collected. The garbage hadn't been collected for months. And that was what was happening. Venezuela was in the grip of neoliberalism. And it's interesting because when Hugo Chavez first was elected in 1999, he said that he did not believe in socialism. He said he was what he called for the third way. He said there was American free market neoliberal capitalism, and there was Soviet-style socialism, but he was for what he called the third way, that Venezuela would embrace the third way, and he called himself a Bolivarian. He was named after Simón Bolivar, the hero of the independence struggle of South America. And he took office on that platform. After 9/11 happened in the United States, he opposed the invasion of Afghanistan, and he showed on national television the children that were being bombed, and he said, 9/11 was a horrendous crime, but it doesn't justify killing innocent children like this. I do not support the U.S. invasion. And furthermore, he appointed to his cabinet a member of the Communist Party. And he said, you're the best guy for the job. You're a communist. I believe in the third way. I'm a Bolivarian. You're the best guy for the job. So then, in 2002, there was a military coup to remove Hugo Chavez from the presidency, and he was removed. And he was taken prisoner, and they were starting to set up a military government. And then the rank-and-file soldiers who were loyal to him, because he had been a rank-and-file soldier, he was a paratrooper, they rose up and they defeated the coup, and ultimately Chavez came back into office, and then he started talking about socialism. He changed the laws around how the state-run oil company operated. It was nominally state-run beforehand, but he changed the laws into how it would be functioning so that the proceeds from the oil would start going into the national budget. He started using that to build infrastructure. And then you had, in Bolivia, you had a Bolivarian government come into power with Evo Morales. Then later in Ecuador, you had Rafael Correa come in, another Bolivarian government. You have Nicaragua, that's coming in, another Bolivarian government. All over Latin America, they created a new bank, the ALBA Bank, or the Alternative Bank of Latin America. And China was essential in what happened in the Bolivarian Revolution. Let's point that out, that China has a very, very close relationship with the Bolivarian countries and the countries in Latin America that are pursuing independence. And that they have always recognized that one of the biggest weaknesses of the Bolivarian Revolution is the fact that it's centered around a state-run oil company. That Venezuela doesn't have a huge steel industry. They don't even have very much food manufacturing there. And that they have oil, and they sell their oil on the international market. They use the proceeds to fund the population. But it's always been a weakness. And that if you look at South America, Bolivarianism, Simón Bolivar didn't believe in having a bunch of independent, different countries. He wanted one nation of South America because these countries' borders were drawn arbitrarily by the European colonizers. And Venezuela was carved onto the map as an oil plantation, right? I mean, that's why it's there. And if you look at Africa, it's the same way. You look at, why is there a little country called Djibouti? Why are there little, if you look at the map, the colonizers were the ones that drew the map. And that there was this feeling that just like the Baathists had said that there was one Arab nation, there was a feeling there was one South American nation, that they are one people, and that they needed to be unified in order to assert their independence and raise people out of poverty. And the goal of Hugo Chavez was to get out of dependency on oil. He said that they wanted to eventually build up their own state-controlled steel industries, their own industries. And there's all this propaganda saying that socialism is the cause for the crisis. But they have a socialist government in Bolivia. And you'll notice there isn't, a shortage of food in Bolivia. Nicaragua right now is the booming center of Central America. At this point, they're building a new canal to challenge the Panama Canal. Chinese investment, my wife is from Guatemala, and people from Guatemala, it used to be low-income people from Guatemala were fleeing up north to the United States. Now people in Guatemala are fleeing south to Nicaragua at this point because things are going so well and there's so much employment. in Nicaragua. The economy there is doing very, very well. So to blame the crisis on socialism is just completely false. And let's keep in mind that the people making these allegations, the very people making these allegations, are the forces that are actively trying to make the situation there worse. The Office of Foreign Assets Control of the United States has been harassing people and threatening them if they send food to Venezuela, right? Chavez is evil, or Maduro is evil supposedly because people there don't have food. But if you try to send food to feed the people there, they'll stop you and they'll send you a letter intimidating you and trying to stop you from doing it. It's the level of just outrageous rhetoric is extreme. But I got to tell you, when I was in Venezuela, I was there even after they lost the election. And I went to these neighborhoods that were strongholds of the Chavista movement, and there was this energy there. People were ready to start building and constructing. They showed me these cable cars that they built to go up the mountains that they constructed. They showed me these beautiful railways that they laid the foundations of. They showed me so much infrastructure development, and it forced me to think of a book that I read when I was first getting into these kind of politics. And it's called I Change Worlds by Anna Louise Strong. It was published in 1934. And this is a book by an American journalist, Anna Louise Strong, and she visited, she had been a leader, a member of the city council in Seattle in 1919 when they had a general strike, and she visited the Soviet Union. And she eventually moved to the Soviet Union and became the editor of the Moscow Times, which was the English language newspaper there. And she wrote this beautiful memoir about how she changed from the United States to the Soviet Union. And in her memoir, she talked about the 5-year plans and how it was that the Soviet Union in the 1930s went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being a modern industrialized country. They built a steel industry. They electrified the entire country. They built modern housing for the population, running water, electricity. I mean, they were producing more steel than the rest of the country, the rest of the world at that point, more tractors than any other country in the world. Now the population was essentially mobilized. And Anna Louise Strong, if you read this book, I Change Worlds, she seems to recognize it. Because the point of this book is she's wrangling with the question of what does it mean to be an American. She writes, there are others like me. I think most Americans are like me. Psychologists call us motor-minded, which means that we think not in terms of visual and auditory images, nor in terms of graphs and plans, but in terms of actions. Perhaps it is our pioneer life that has made it so it's journeying us to the West, which we can neither visualize nor hear, nor plan, but only march to. Perhaps it's the effect upon our nervous system of the machines which we, unlike the rest of the world, are born knowing. She seems to identify something uniquely American in what she saw in the Soviet Union when people were building. And she talks about going to parts of the Soviet Union that had just been, had just been completely deindustrialized. And she talks about how the workers that were there and were constructing, she says, they were too busy exploring, developing, and building to think of personal comfort. They were pioneers of a new type. They were real men with a past tested by prison and death and achievement under seemingly impossible odds. And now they had turned to the task of rebuilding a war-ruined land. Every year since the revolution, war had come when the snows and swamps of the Finland were passable, every winter for the past 5 years. And she just goes on, it's beautiful. She describes, she's not talking about Stalin, she's not talking about the leaders of the Bolshevik Party, she's talking about average Russians who were just mobilized to build their country up from nothing. And she continues to go back to it. She makes comparisons to the pioneers of the United States. And she brings up, there's a famous phrase that Horace Greeley, one of the great thinkers of the United States, he famously said, "Go west, young man." It's very famous. And there's a problem with that, though. We can't say, "Go west, young man." Right? We can't say that. Why can't we say that? Because go west, young man, yes, it was about building. It was about constructing. But it was also about slaughtering the Native Americans. It was also about slavery. It was about really, really ugly things. And that spirit that she talks about being the American spirit, that drive to get things done, for all of us who are educated about history, it's tainted. It's tainted because we know what was really going on at that time. That building that we were doing, that energy that we had, it was tied in with hurting and beating down other people. And that's a reality that we have to face. And there's a time, for those of us who are smart enough to understand how the construction of the United States was based on the slaughter of indigenous people and the killing of African Americans and slavery. For those of us who understand it, when we hear Donald Trump say, "Make America great again," it just hits you in your gut. And you say, "Make America great again." What does he want us to go bomb Korea again and kill thousands of people in Korea? Does he want us to go bomb Vietnam and kill more people? I mean, how can he say that? He's not acknowledging the history of what actually went on. He's not acknowledging the mass murder that went on. I've traveled to the Middle East, and in the Middle East, I've been to Iran, and Shia Islam is a little bit different, obviously, than Sunni Islam, and they have a concept of haram. They talk about haram, and haram is this idea, there are things that are forbidden, but in the Shia tradition, the way they understand the concept of haram is they talk about, that if something, they say, like, for example, if you steal food and you eat it, it might make you sick, right? Or that if you buy a house, and the loan that you use to buy the house is like a usurious loan that violates the Islamic teachings, that house is dangerous to live in. It might catch on fire. And the idea is that if something is acquired in an immoral way, that it's tainted and that it's dangerous. And we have to recognize that at one point in the United States, yes, we did have the highest standard of living in the world. We had houses and cars, and the rest of the world had been blown up by the Second World War, and we had the booming economy. And that booming economy, which, the African American community certainly didn't see, the Latino community certainly didn't see, but white Americans certainly saw, it was a booming economy, but that was a bribe. And that was a bribe to buy our loyalty to empire and colonialism and destruction. And that it's all going away, because when it gets down to it, it was acquired in an impure and an immoral way. That construction, that building, that desire to create, it wasn't building for yourself, it was building at the expense of someone else. And that when you're acquiring things at the expense of someone else, that's tainted. And that is something that needs to be acknowledged. But at the same time, leftist groups in the United States, there's a real problem that we have, which is that people don't want to hate themselves. They just don't, right? No one wants to think, "I am shit. I'm off." You think about it, I almost imagine like a leftist in the United States going to the home of somebody, knock, knock, knock. "Hello, I'm from the local socialist and communist organization." "Oh, great. Well, tell me all about your group." "Well, this house you got is too good for you. Most people in the world, they don't live anything like this. We want to take your home away from you so that you know what it's like to be a third world person." The person says, "Okay, go on. Furthermore, that American flag you got hanging out there, that's a symbol of genocide and mass murder, so we're going to be lighting it on fire." Meanwhile, the land that your house is on, that was stolen from Native Americans, so you should be very ashamed of yourself. And then the person says, "Really? So what is the goal of your organization?" "Well, the only way we ever see ourselves coming to power is if there's some kind of catastrophic, violent revolution in which millions of people die. So you'll sign up and join, right?" I get that image in my head, and that's a real problem that the left has. That there are millions of young people in the United States who are very worried about the future of their country. And they're very worried about the fact that, beautiful neighborhoods are now dotted with empty foreclosed homes. That the standard of living is much lower for the next generation than the previous generation. But when you go to a leftist group, the message that leftist groups have, particularly for young white men, is you have it too good. You think too highly of yourself. You like yourself too much. And I just want to put, everyone to kind of put themselves in the place of a young white man in the United States, or a young white person, could be a woman. But think about it. Their parents had a much higher standard of living than they had, right? They're born into this world. They get a college degree. They run up student debt. They're out on their own. And they're working a job, maybe their parents got paid, $50,000, $60,000 a year. They're making $20,000 a year at Starbucks. And they've got a boss that they can't stand, a boss who's just driving them to work harder. And their schedule is inconsistent. And every morning they're trying to get up in the morning. And they're trying to feel good about themselves and trying to feel like they achieved something in the world. And if a political organization comes to them and says, "You like yourself too much," they're not going to listen to it. You can just forget about it. And the dangerous thing is, the rise of these disgusting fascist groups, these white nationalists, those groups don't ask these people to hate themselves. These groups appeal to a sense of pride based on bigotry and primitive hate and all kinds of things, but they do try to build people up. there was a tweet made by one of the InfoWars writers, and he tweeted out, he said, no one could believe in socialism or communism unless they hate themselves. And I looked at that tweet and I thought, really? Do you think Fidel Castro hated himself? Do you think Hugo Chavez hated himself? Do you think Mao or Stalin or Kim Il-sung hated themselves? What is he talking about? He's not talking about the people around the world, the people in impoverished countries that have taken control of their economies and started building up from poverty. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a very, very different movement. A movement that appeals to very, very different feelings. A movement that would not approve of 90% of what we're saying here tonight. That's what he's talking about. And that's what socialism and communism has become synonymous with in the United States. And that's a big problem. If socialism were... If I, when I was young and in Ohio, had started reading about socialism and communism and thought it was a way to tear myself down or tear down and destroy all the neighborhoods and all that, I wouldn't have given it a chance for 1 second. And there's a big problem in the way the left relates to people. We need to recognize that things like racism exist, things like sexism exist. We need to talk about these things, but the left has gotten very, very confused. If you go to China today, they're building huge, huge amounts of infrastructure. 700 million people lifted out of poverty. There are 30 million people in China that are still in poverty. They want that to be gotten rid of by 2020. They have amazing goals. They're building all kinds of roads. But here in the United States, in 27 different states, we're actually depaving the roads. We're unpaving the roads. We are the largest economy in the world. China's the second largest economy in the world. But right now, we're actually unpaving the roads. There's some big problems that we have to recognize. And we've gotten to the point that there was a time when capitalists made money by building roads. There's a time when capitalists made money by creating steel mills and hiring people and paying them to make steel mills. We've gotten to the point where capitalism is functioning by making money off destruction. You look at the prison industrial complex. The more crime that goes on, the more people that get locked up, the more money they get to make. You look at the opioid epidemic. The big pharmaceutical companies, the more addicted people get, the more people's lives are destroyed, the more money they ultimately make. If you look at it, the capitalists have all figured out how they can keep enriching themselves while society falls into ruin. And the only way that can ultimately be resolved is if the economy is taken control of, if we seize control of the major centers of economic power and force them to work in the interests of society. And that will mean that our relationship with the world is going to have to change. If we continue to operate and interact with the world on the basis of keeping the world poor so that we can maintain a monopoly, it's not going to work. I'm very excited about the new Silk Road and the One Belt, One Road initiative. And what's coming out of China right now is this understanding that peace can be carried out and peace can be achieved through international cooperation. And that two countries are trading with each other and becoming wealthier in the process. Not one country getting rich while the other country gets poorer, but both of them trading with each other and getting wealthier in the process, that the world can become much better and we can have peace through international cooperation. And there's this understanding, there's a word, we talk about socialism or whatever, let's talk about statecraft, right? Let's go back to the time of King Henry VIII, the Tudor monarchy. What did they do? They built all kinds of roads and they built all kinds of universities. There used to be just a basic understanding in civilization that the government had an obligation to make sure that the population was taken care of, and that the government had an obligation to oversee economic forces and build a better life. That's been gotten rid of. In the age of neoliberalism, those who make money, the capitalists, have no obligation whatsoever. They can do whatever they want, they can make lots of money, and screw the rest of us, right? And the notion of the people, has been forgotten. You'll hear politicians talk about individuals, and you'll hear people talk about humanity as one. But this concept of the people, populism, the people, that's been gotten rid of. And that concept of the people, that was the basis of the Renaissance. That was the difference between medieval Europe and Renaissance Europe, was this concept of the people, that there was a duty on the part of the state to serve the people. In medieval times, the people were said to serve the nobility. But in the Renaissance, there was an awakening in Europe, this idea that the state had an obligation to the people, and that it wasn't a one-sided relationship, that human beings were not chattel and property, that they had basic rights, and that those who governed them had an obligation to serve them. This is a change that's been forgotten in the world that we live in.